Have you ever wondered why your cravings feel stronger after 40, even when your discipline feels stronger too? You wake up determined to eat well, to stay balanced, to resist the pull of sugar, alcohol, or late-night snacking, and yet by mid-afternoon something shifts. Irritability creeps in, focus fades. A quiet but persistent urge begins whispering that relief is just one indulgence away. For many adults over 40, this is not a failure of character. It is not a collapse of willpower. It is biology speaking through the language of craving. The truth is that nutrition, gut health, and metabolic stability play a far greater role in reward-seeking behavior than most of us were ever taught. As we age, the body's regulatory systems become more sensitive, more reactive, and sometimes more fragile. Blood sugar no longer rises and falls with the resilience it once had. Sleep becomes lighter. Stress lingers longer in the bloodstream. And in that subtle physiological instability, the brain begins searching for fast solutions. Quick dopamine, quick comfort, quick energy. When blood glucose spikes after a high sugar or highly processed meal, the brain experiences a surge of fuel followed by an equally dramatic drop. That drop is not just physical fatigue, it is an emotional contraction. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of judgment and impulse control, becomes less efficient when energy availability fluctuates. Irritability increases, anxiety sharpens, patience thins. In that state, the promise of sugar, alcohol, or other substances feels less like indulgence and more like survival. The brain, designed to protect you, interprets instability as threat and urges you toward immediate reward. This is why cravings after 40 often feel urgent and persuasive. They are amplified by metabolic shifts that make the brain more sensitive to imbalance. The gut plays an equally profound role in this story. The gut-brain axis is not a metaphor. It is a literal, bidirectional communication system linking your gastrointestinal tract to your central nervous system through neural pathways like the vagus nerve, as well as hormonal and immune signals. The microbes living in your intestines help regulate inflammation, produce neurotransmitter precursors, and influence mood. When microbial diversity declines due to stress, poor diet, antibiotics, or aging itself, neurotransmitter production can shift. Serotonin pathways may become less stable. Dopamine signaling may fluctuate. Chronic low-grade inflammation can quietly interfere with executive function and emotional regulation. What feels like a moral struggle is often an inflammatory process impairing clarity and restraint. Dr. Anna Lempsey, whose work has illuminated the neurobiology of addiction and reward, reminds us that the brain is constantly balancing pain and pleasure on a delicate scale. After 40, that scale can become more sensitive to disruption. Metabolic inflexibility, reduced insulin sensitivity, and increased stress reactivity create a physiological environment in which small triggers feel large. A skipped meal, a poor night of sleep, or an argument can tip the balance toward craving. Understanding this shifts the narrative from shame to strategy. It reframes cravings not as personal weakness, but as signals pointing toward underlying instability. When we begin to see cravings as data rather than defects, we gain the power to respond with intelligence instead of self-criticism. And that is where real change begins. What makes this even more complex is that the very systems designed to protect you can begin working against you when they are chronically overstimulated. After 40, metabolic flexibility often declines, meaning the body becomes less efficient at switching between fuel sources such as glucose and fat. Insulin sensitivity may decrease, and with that decrease comes a narrower margin for error. A meal that once caused only a mild fluctuation in energy can now produce a sharp spike followed by a destabilizing crash. That crash does not merely leave you tired, it subtly reshapes perception. The world feels heavier. Tasks feel more overwhelming. Minor stressors feel amplified. In that vulnerable state, the brain scans for rapid relief. It remembers that sugar acts quickly. It recalls that alcohol softens edges. It knows that highly processed foods deliver a predictable surge of dopamine. This is not weakness, it is conditioning layered onto biology. The inflammatory pathways involved in chronic metabolic imbalance further complicate the picture. Low-grade systemic inflammation can impair the functioning of the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for long-term planning, impulse control, and emotional regulation. When inflammation rises, even slightly, executive function can diminish. Decisions become more reactive. Emotional tolerance shrinks. Cravings feel less negotiable. You may tell yourself that you will resist, yet in the moment of fatigue or agitation, the capacity to pause feels compromised. Meanwhile, the gut-brain axis continues sending signals. Disruptions in microbial diversity can alter the production of short-chain fatty acids and other metabolites that influence neural signaling. Certain gut bacteria contribute to the synthesis of precursors for serotonin and dopamine, and when that ecosystem is imbalanced, neurotransmitter availability can shift in subtle but meaningful ways. The vagus nerve transmits information about inflammation and nutrient status directly to the brain, shaping mood and stress response. Over time, a cycle can emerge. Unstable blood sugar fuels inflammation. Inflammation impairs impulse control. Impaired impulse control leads to choices that further destabilize blood sugar. It is a feedback loop that feels psychological but is profoundly physiological. At this point in life, sleep disturbances often enter the equation. Fragmented sleep elevates cortisol, increases insulin resistance, and heightens reward sensitivity the following day. Stress reactivity also tends to intensify with accumulated responsibilities, caregiving demands, career pressures, and health concerns. Cortisol and adrenaline, when persistently elevated, shift the brain toward short-term survival strategies. Long-term goals become abstract compared to immediate comfort. This is the quiet escalation that many people do not notice at first. A few extra sweets in the afternoon. A second glass of wine to unwind. More frequent reliance on ultra-processed snacks during stressful weeks. Gradually, the brain adapts to these repeated dopamine surges by recalibrating its baseline. What once felt indulgent becomes normal. What once satisfied no longer fully does. And here is where suspense enters the story, because the question becomes unavoidable. If the brain has adapted to instability, can it adapt back to stability? The answer is yes, but not without intention. The same neuroplasticity that reinforces craving can be harnessed to restore balance. The body remains responsive to nutritional shifts, microbial repair, and inflammatory reduction even after 40. However, the path forward requires understanding that cravings are downstream effects of upstream imbalances. Without addressing blood sugar regulation, gut diversity, sleep architecture, and stress physiology, attempts at sheer willpower will continue to feel exhausting. The real transformation begins not with restriction, but with stabilization. Stabilization begins with a radical shift in perspective, because the goal is no longer to silence cravings through force, but to quiet the physiological noise that generates them. When blood sugar is regulated through balanced meals that combine protein, fiber, and healthy fats, glucose rises more gradually and falls more predictably, allowing the brain to experience a steady supply of energy rather than dramatic surges and collapses. This steadiness protects the prefrontal cortex, preserving clarity, patience, and decision-making capacity. When ultra-processed foods are reduced and replaced with whole, nutrient-dense options, inflammatory signaling begins to calm, and the immune system stops broadcasting subtle distress messages that impair emotional regulation. Over time, insulin sensitivity can improve, restoring some of the metabolic flexibility that seemed lost. The gut microbiome responds with remarkable adaptability when fed diverse plant fibers, fermented foods, and minimally processed nutrients. Microbial diversity expands, short-chain fatty acid production increases, and communication along the gut-brain axis becomes more balanced. As inflammation decreases, neurotransmitter precursors are produced in a more stable rhythm, and mood variability often softens. Sleep, too, becomes a therapeutic intervention rather than an afterthought. Protecting sleep through consistent timing, reduced evening stimulation, and light exposure management lowers cortisol and improves glucose regulation the following day. Stress modulation practices such as breathwork, moderate exercise, and deliberate recovery periods recalibrate the nervous system, signaling safety rather than threat. In that state of safety, the brain's reward circuitry becomes less desperate for artificial spikes of dopamine. The pleasure-pain balance that Dr. Anna Lempsey describes begins to level out, not because pleasure is eliminated, but because it is no longer compensating for hidden deficits. What once felt like an uncontrollable urge gradually transforms into a manageable signal. You begin to notice that cravings are quieter when meals are consistent, when sleep is restorative, and when stress is addressed before it accumulates. This awareness creates agency. Instead of reacting impulsively, you start responding strategically. You recognize early warning signs of dysregulation and intervene upstream with nourishment, rest, or movement. The brain, remarkably plastic even after 40, adapts to this new pattern. Dopamine receptors recalibrate. Reward sensitivity normalizes. The baseline for satisfaction rises in a healthier direction. Sustainable recovery and long-term brain stability are not achieved through punishment or deprivation, but through metabolic integrity and inflammatory balance. When the body is supported, the mind follows. When the gut is diversified, mood steadies. When blood sugar stabilizes, impulse control strengthens. The transformation is gradual, almost quiet, but profoundly cumulative. Each stable meal, each restorative night of sleep, each intentional pause in a stressful moment reinforces neural pathways aligned with resilience rather than reactivity. Over weeks and months, the identity shifts from someone battling cravings to someone maintaining equilibrium. That shift is empowering because it is grounded in physiology, not fantasy. It acknowledges the realities of aging metabolism while affirming the capacity for renewal. Your brain is not broken. Your willpower is not defective. Your cravings are signals that can be decoded and redirected through informed action. If you are benefiting from our topics, please subscribe, like, and turn on the bell notification so you can see our new videos early.